December 7th, 2009, West Valley City, Utah. A winter storm rages throughout the night. Inches of snow gather on the ground. Fleets of snowplows hit the road just before dawn. Debbie Caldwell, a daycare provider, is awake early, getting ready for the children to arrive that morning. Two of the kids, Charlie and Braden Powell, always arrived at 6:40 a.m. each morning. This morning, however, something was different. The Powell children did not arrive. Debbie grows concerned and drives over to the Powell household. On the ground, she sees no tire tracks exiting the garage, no footprints from the front door. Neither adult was picking up their phones. Where was Susan Powell, the children's mother, and her husband, Josh, their two children? This was not like Susan. Fear began to grow in Debbie, and so she called the family's listed emergency contact, Josh Powell's sister, Jennifer Graves. Jennifer grabbed her kids and her mom, Tarika, and started driving down the snow-filled roads toward Josh and Susan's house. On the way, Tarika dialed 911. Patrol officers from the West Valley City Police Department arrive at the Powell house just minutes later. They pounded on the door, shouting for Josh and Susan, but received no response. The officers, along with the family, become concerned. They fear that the family could be inside the house, suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. Officers checked all the doors and windows, and all were locked. They tried peering in through the windows, but all of them seemed to be covered. They asked Tarika if they can break a window. After some hesitation, she agrees. The police sergeant crawled in through the broken window and found himself in the living room of the Powell house. The first thing he saw were two box fans aimed at wet spots on the carpet and couch. A stereo had been left on. No one was inside. It seemed they had a missing persons case on their hands. Eventually, Josh Powell would answer his phone and return to the house that afternoon with his two sons, Charlie and Braden. Susan, however, was not with him. She would never be seen again. Josh told police that he had taken the kids out camping the night before, after midnight. He claimed he thought it was Saturday night and not Sunday, which is why he missed work. He said the last time he had seen Susan was the night before when he left for the camping trip. He said he did not answer any of the worried phone calls that morning, as his phone had died. As Josh spoke, detectives could clearly see a phone charger plugged into Josh's car. Camping after midnight in a snowstorm with two young children. Detectives did not buy it. Josh Powell was taken in for questioning. A search of the family's minivan would reveal that Susan's phone was with him the entire time, hidden at the bottom of the car's center console. During interrogation, Josh Powell would not cooperate with police and quickly asked for a lawyer. Within hours, he would become the prime suspect in his wife's disappearance. Months and then years passed. It became clear to both the authorities and the public that Susan was dead and that Josh was her murderer. But despite this, Josh Powell would never be arrested for the murder of his wife. The question gnawed at everyone. Where is Susan Powell? It's a question that remains unanswered to this day. After a tight custody battle, Charlie and Braden, Susan's sons, were removed from Josh's custody and placed with their maternal grandparents. Josh, however, was allowed visitation. One day, with legal and public pressure mounting upon him, Josh Powell would do the unthinkable. On February 5th, 2012, during a visitation with his sons, Josh Powell set fire to his house, killing his two young children along with himself. The truth of what happened to Susan would die along with them. This is the true story of the disappearance of Susan Powell and the investigation and murders that were to follow. Welcome to today's video, and thank you for riding the crime wave with me. Information for today's video was sourced from the book If I Can't Have You by Greg Olson and Rebecca Morris, as well as the incredible first season of the podcast Cold, published by KSL Media and reported by Dave Cawley. If you want to do a deep dive into this case for yourself, I cannot recommend enough the Cold podcast. It is one of the best pieces of journalism I have ever had the pleasure to listen to. Another note before we begin. I am making the conscious choice not to include any pictures of Charlie and Braden Powell in this video. There's some murky moral gray areas you can find yourself in when making true crime content, and while I do think these types of stories need to be told, something about the images of minors living on in a YouTube video about their deaths does not sit right with me, and for that reason I will not be including those images. With all that said and out of the way, let's let our story begin. Susan Cox was the third daughter of Charles and Judy Cox, a couple who were devout practitioners of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly referred to as the Mormon Church. Susan was born on October 16, 1981 in New Mexico, and lived for a brief time in Alaska before their family moved to the city of Puyallup, Washington, in Washington State. This would be the city in which she was raised, and the place where she would meet her future husband, Josh Powell. Joshua Powell was born on January 20th, 1976 in Puyallup, Washington, to his parents Steve and Tarika Powell. Josh was the second child, their first boy. Josh had an older sister, Jennifer, and would soon be followed by a younger brother, John, another brother, Michael, and then a younger sister, Alina. Stephen Powell baptized Josh into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when Josh was 8 years old. Personal records from Stephen Powell at that time, however, revealed that he had already, in secret, renounced his faith. The Powell household would grow to be deeply dysfunctional. Steve would tell his sons that, quote, people were just animals and should be able to have sex with anyone at any time. He allowed them access to his pornographic magazines. Most disturbingly, he found himself attracted to his oldest daughter, Jennifer. Steve wanted to tear Jennifer away from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. When she became a teen, he told her that the Book of Mormon was false. Tarika found out and was so upset that she moved out of the house. She had had enough of her husband and told Steve she wanted a divorce. Steve did not take it well. All of this family turmoil would make its mark on Josh. Divorce records from that time show that around 1989, when Josh was 13, he threatened his mom with a butcher's knife. He also killed his 4-year-old sister Alina's pet gerbils and then made her touch their blood. He also tried to hang himself when he was 14, the event leaving him with bruising around his neck. His mother pushed him into counseling, but it did not last. During the divorce, Josh lashed out as his mother. He told her that he was going to move in with Steve. Steve manipulated his children, making them believe that their mother was the cause of all of their family turmoil. Steve moved back to Puyallup, Washington at the beginning of 1994. Josh by then was a high school senior, turning 18. He, John, and Michael made the move to Washington as well. Shortly thereafter, Josh graduated high school and started attending college classes in the fall. In August of 1994, Jennifer, the oldest of the Powell children, got married to a man named Kirk Graves. Steve was absent from the ceremony. Jennifer refused to invite her dad. She would be the only Powell child that was able to escape the dark influence of their father. That fall, Josh decided to attend Institute classes. Institute classes are where college-age Mormon church members go to study their faith and to socialize. At one of these classes, Josh saw a girl who looked familiar. Her name was Susan Cox. As they chatted, Susan said she remembered Josh having played the piano at her home years earlier. He had come over in an effort to date her older sister, Mary. Now he was 24. Susan had just turned 19. Josh insisted on holding dinner parties at his apartment in Tacoma, Washington, hosting friends from church. One night, he decided to invite Susan Cox. When the meal was done that night, Josh asked for his guests' help doing the dishes. Susan volunteered. They shared their first kiss that night. Susan later wrote in her journal that's when she knew that Josh was the one. She was taken in by Josh. She thought he was smart, attractive, and appeared to live by the church's standards. Josh was 5 years older than her. He seemed more mature than men her age. They marked November 11th, 2000 as the start of their relationship. They talked about getting married from that very day. Shortly after Christmas, just under 2 months of dating, Susan and Josh got engaged. Susan's friends were concerned. So were her parents. Josh pressured for a quick marriage. He wasn't going to let Susan escape. He'd also start to spend Susan's money freely. Eventually, he would exert total control over their finances. They married on the afternoon of April 6, 2001, in the Portland Temple of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Shortly thereafter, not being able to afford a place for themselves, the young couple moved in with Josh's father, Steve Powell. Josh and Susan had very little privacy. Josh's brothers John and Michael also lived at the house and came and went at all hours. Worse than that, Steve would become infatuated with his daughter-in-law in an extremely perverse manner. He would write hundreds of pages in his journal describing the explicit sexual fantasies he was having about Susan. Steve always had a video camera in hand and would constantly film Susan both with and without her knowledge. On at least one occasion, Susan thought she saw a small mirror coming under the crack of the door while she was using the bathroom. It was a dark time for Susan, to say the least. On top of all of that, Josh began to waver in his faith and soon would stop going to church entirely. Eventually, he would openly mock Susan's commitment to the Mormon faith. By March, they had moved out of Steve's home into their own place. Steve Powell watched on from afar. He visited their Yakima apartment one night and offered to give Susan a massage. Perhaps naively, she allowed him to rub her feet and shoulders. Later that night, Steve put a camcorder on a tripod and filmed himself undressing while describing what he had done. Steve's obsession for his daughter-in-law had reached a boiling point. On July 13th, 2003, Steve met Josh and Susan at a commercial trucking business. Josh was considering a career change. This time, he wanted to be a trucker. Steve offered to give Susan a ride back to her parents' house, as Josh would be busy for a while. Susan accepted. Finally, Steve got to be alone with Susan. It was something he had dreamed of for months. He secretly filmed her from the driver's seat of the minivan, and when she entered the car, he quickly shoved the camera into his bag. It did not stop recording. The video was black, but the camera's microphone captured all of the audio that was about to occur. On the drive home, Steve confessed his love for Susan.
It'd be great to go to Colorado and see a different part of the U.S., you know?
Yeah. I'm probably wrong, but I've really fallen in love with you. Maybe I'm interpreting something that I shouldn't be interpreting. It just, for example, when we were sitting on the couch, it just felt like you were very, I was extremely aroused, and I think you were somewhat aroused, at least I thought.
I don't know where you're going with this.
Susan, I'll tell you what
I'm married to your son, and I should just be the daughter-in-law.
I know.
Which puts me a step beneath your own children.
Okay.
And that's where I'm comfortable. I was kind of meaning to talk to you about this. My own father doesn't kiss me, and you kiss me, and I didn't like that.
And you don't want me to hug you either.
Susan, of course, was shocked and uncomfortable. She denied the advances of her father-in-law. When he got home, Steve was an emotional wreck. He wrote in his journal that night that he was in deep pain, that Susan had led him on. He then went back to his video camera to see if he captured any good shots of Susan. That's when he discovered the recording of their conversation. He went through it again and again, analyzing every word. He convinced himself that Susan had not, in fact, rejected him. Susan told her husband what had happened. Josh was furious. He kept his distance from Steve, but only for a little while. By September, Steve was writing in his journal that Josh had come around to his point of view. The couple then decided they needed to get away from Washington, and so they decided to move to Utah, to the Salt Lake City area. They purchased a house on Sarah Circle Road in the neighborhood of West Valley City. Susan studied for and passed the test to become a broker and transferred from a temp position to a full-time position. She was now the main breadwinner of their young family, which would soon be growing. In June of that year, Susan discovered that she was pregnant. Charlie Powell, their first son, was born on January 19, 2005. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, traveled to Utah to witness the birth of their grandson. When Susan went into labor, her parents had to drive her to the hospital. Josh was too occupied with his computer. He arrived to the hospital an hour late and was disinterested, sitting in the corner on his laptop as his son was born. Susan spent 5 weeks on maternity leave. During that time, Josh still refused to get a job and continued to spend money that the couple did not have. Susan confided in the bishop at her church, who suggested marriage counseling, but Josh refused. He had quit going to church altogether and resented how much time his wife spent focused on her faith. He perceived her time spent at church as time spent neglecting him. Josh also refused to be intimate with Susan, to the extent that he would not kiss her or even hold her hand, saying he feared he would get sick. The two took out a second mortgage on their house to get by as incomes dwindled. Josh had taken a stab at a at-home realty business, but it did not succeed. In fact, it had begun to collapse. In the middle of all of this, Susan learned she was pregnant once again. Susan delivered their second child, another boy, on January 2nd, 2007. They named him Braden Powell. In April of that year, Josh and Susan filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. By the start of 2008, it was clear to Susan she could not depend on Josh to support their family, and so she landed a position at Wells Fargo Investments. Despite this, Josh locked Susan out of their joint bank account. He spent money freely, but scrutinized every penny she spent, especially on groceries. He complained about how much money they spent on food for the kids when, quote, "they're just going to poop it out anyway." Josh limited his son's food intake so much that Charlie was eventually diagnosed with malnutrition. On top of that, Josh limited Susan's access to transportation. They only had one car, one that Josh refused to let Susan drive. Instead, she had to ride a bicycle to work, miles through the rain and snow every day. Susan began to discuss with her friends and family that she was preparing for a divorce. She had realized she was in an abusive relationship. She told her coworkers, "If anything is to happen to me, make sure the police look at Josh, even if it looks like an accident." In retrospect, these are haunting words. Instead of divorce papers, they signed paperwork establishing a trust. If Susan were to die, the trust gave control of her assets to Josh. He had laid the seeds to profit in the event that his wife were to die. On November 25, 2009, Josh Powell purchased an acetylene torch. It was capable of burning through steel. A few days later, Susan would disappear. Which brings our story back to Monday, December 7th, 2009. Detective Ellis Maxwell sits at his desk reviewing a bank robbery case. His sergeant walks him and tells him to help patrol officers with a missing family. As he made his way to the house on Sarah Circle Drive, outside, he saw a crowd of patrol officers, family, friends, and neighbors. The officers shared what little information they had. The last anyone had heard from the Powells was about noon the day prior. They hadn't said anything to anyone about taking a trip. Detective Maxwell took a walk inside the house. He saw no signs of a struggle or robbery. All doors and windows were secure. There were 2 box fans that were set up in the front room, blowing on the carpet and the couch. It was very obvious that the couch had been cleaned. He moved down the hallway to the master bedroom. There, he found Susan's purse, which contained her ID, keys, credit cards. No cash was missing. A neighbor, Joanna Owings, came up to Detective Maxwell. She was the last person who had seen the family. She was at their house the afternoon before, knitting a blanket. Josh, out of form, had made pancakes for the 2 women. She then left around 5 p.m. when Susan said she was tired and went down for a nap. Investigators would later speculate that Josh may have put something in Susan's food, causing her to fall asleep. Giovanna had tried multiple times that morning to call Josh and Susan. Her son was able to get through to him at 3:02 p.m. Her son was so nervous that when Josh answered the phone, he hung up. Giovanna called him back. She asked, "Josh, where are you? Everybody's worried. No one's seen Susan. They said she didn't go to work. You need to come home." Giovanna relayed all of this information to Detective Maxwell. Jennifer's phone rang just before 5:30 p.m. It was Josh. Jennifer answered and frantically asked her brother where had he been. Was Susan with him? Josh said he was at work and the boys were with him. Jennifer knew he was not at work. Josh then admitted that he had taken the boys camping and had been stranded in a snowstorm. Jennifer asked Josh, "Where is Susan?" Josh replied, asking, "What do you know?" Chills went down Jennifer's spine. She told her brother he had to come home, that there were cops there. Josh agreed. He said he'd arrive, quote, "soon." It would be another hour until Josh finally pulled up to the house. When Josh's minivan arrived, Detective Maxwell approached the passenger side window. He asked Josh where had he been. Josh said he had stopped for Little Caesar's Pizza. When asked why Josh was not answering the phone, he told Detective Maxwell that his battery was low and he did not have a charger. Detective Maxwell could clearly see a phone charger plugged into the car's center console. He told Josh they needed to speak at the police department. Josh agreed. At the police station, Detective Maxwell asked Josh to describe in detail the events of the last 48 hours. Josh said Susan had gone to church on Sunday and then came home around noon. Their neighbor Giovanna had come over and Josh made them pancakes. Josh claimed that after Giovanna left, he stayed at home with the boys. He said that Susan woke up around 6:30 p.m., ate dinner, and then took another nap. Josh said he then decided to take his son Charlie sledding and came home around 8 p.m. He then read a book to Charlie and put him to bed. Susan, he claimed, woke up at 10 p.m. and asked Josh to clean the couch with the rug doctor. Josh said he set up fans in the living room in order to dry the couch after cleaning it to prevent mildew from forming. Detective Maxwell wanted specifics about the camping trip. Josh told him that Susan had known about the trip and was okay with it. He said he left his home between 1:30 and 2 a.m. that morning, driving his minivan down to the Pony Express Trail. It was not a convincing alibi. What kind of father would take his 2- and 4-year-old sons out of bed at 2 a.m. to go camping in sub-freezing cold? At the conclusion of their interview, Detective Maxwell asked Josh if he could search the minivan. Josh agreed. The minivan was packed with supplies, but the most interesting discovery came from the car's center console. In it, they found a pink Motorola cell phone buried deep in the storage area. It was Susan's. Josh looked like a deer in headlights. Detective Maxwell asked Josh, "Why do you have Susan's cell phone?" Josh started to stumble over his words, saying he borrowed her phone the day before and must have forgotten it in his pocket. Detective Maxwell did not buy it. Why would he take his phone out of his pocket and then bury it hidden in the car's console? Furthermore, Josh had called Susan's cell phone twice that afternoon to leave voicemails. Why would he do that if he knew that Susan's cell phone was right next to him the entire time? Detective Maxwell knew it was Josh trying to establish an alibi. Unfortunately, this was not enough information to arrest Josh Powell. Frustratingly, he was allowed to go home. A search warrant for the family home was not issued that night. Police told Josh that he would have to come in the next morning at 9 a.m. for a follow-up interview. That night, neighbors reported seeing Josh going to and from the minivan and the house. It seemed to them that he was cleaning. Josh's sister Jennifer arrived at the house that morning to take care of the children while Josh went to the police station. When she arrived, she had been suspecting that Josh had done something horrible to Susan. This was almost confirmed when she found Josh frantically cleaning the house. By the time he left for his interview at police headquarters, it was 12 p.m., over 3 hours late. He and Detective Maxwell entered an interrogation room. Almost immediately, Josh started to say that he should have an attorney present. Eventually, Detective Maxwell got Josh to relay the events of the day before. He said he left the house with Charlie and Braden around 2 a.m. and drove straight to the Pony Express Trail. Most of the land along the Pony Express Trail is public, and people can set up camp wherever they want. He claimed to have reached his campsite around 4 a.m. that Monday morning. He would never reveal to the investigators the exact location of his claimed campsite, saying he could not remember. He told detectives that he awoke when the sun rose, which was around 7 a.m., giving him about 3 hours of sleep. He said he and the boys then roasted marshmallows and then drove aimlessly for a couple of hours. At 12 p.m., he decided to come home. At the same time that his interview was being conducted, police asked Josh's sister Jennifer to bring Charlie and Braden to the South Valley Children's Justice Center to be interviewed. Charlie was 4 years old and not the most reliable witness, but even so, he told police something disturbing. He said that Mommy had gone camping with them, but then stayed behind in the place where, quote, the shiny rocks and pretty crystals were. Detectives thought this sounded a lot like the West Desert. Despite this, Josh Powell was not placed under arrest. He was allowed to go home. Even with Charlie's interview, police still did not have any concrete evidence from which to make an arrest. They did, however, have clear motive. The investigation revealed that Josh Powell was the beneficiary of several life insurance policies, totaling $1.5 million on Susan. At the house, a search warrant was issued. A team of detectives paid special attention to the area where the two fans had been pointed in the living room. They discovered evidence of blood on the floor between the couch and the front door. Back at the station, investigators finished writing a search warrant for the family minivan. Josh had left the interrogation room at around 4:15 p.m., but with his car being searched, he was not able to leave. He waited in the lobby for the search to conclude. Forensic experts scanned the car for traces of blood, but found nothing. As they wrapped up their search of the minivan, they placed a GPS beacon on the car so they could track Josh's movements. At 9 p.m., Detective Maxwell entered the lobby to give Josh his keys, but Josh was gone. Only 10 minutes earlier, he had decided to leave. He called the taxicab from the police station and went to the Salt Lake City airport. He did not get on a plane. Instead, he rented a car. Rental car records would later show that he put 800 miles on the car in the next 18 hours. Where Josh Powell went during these 800 miles is unknown to this day, other than the fact that he drove 90 minutes to purchase and activate a new cell phone. Josh Powell was in the wind. Wednesday, December 9th, 2009, detectives conducted a helicopter search of the Pony Express Trail looking for Josh's campsite. They could see no obvious tire tracks in the snow and found no signs of Susan. News reports began to air that night regarding Susan Powell's disappearance. Josh was still missing, out on the road. After 18 hours on the road, Josh arrived back in West Valley to pick up his minivan. That is when police discovered he had rented a car. They followed this lead, but it would not lead to any fruitful information. When Josh arrived home that night, he saw TV news camped out on his front lawn. The media would scrutinize Josh in the days, weeks, and years to come. The coverage of the case went national. Susan's work friend Amber told detectives that Josh once said he knew where to hide a body if he were ever to commit a murder. He said he would dump it in an abandoned mine. 9 days into the investigation, detectives started to search abandoned mine shafts. These efforts would go on for years, with hundreds of mine sites investigated. Each one turned up nothing. 12 days after Susan's disappearance, Josh loaded up the minivan. He was moving out of Utah. He took his sons back to Puyallup, Washington, to live with his father, Steve, along with Josh's siblings, Michael, John, and Alina. In Washington, the media continued to hound him. They, along with detectives, suspected that Josh was involved in Susan's disappearance. In response, Josh decided to publish a website titled SusanPowell.org, the official website of Susan Powell. On the website, Josh defended himself as a victim of a smear campaign conducted by both the media and the LDS Church. Blog posts would be posted disparaging the church and even disparaging Susan. They called her a mother who abandoned her family. They even speculated that her disappearance was connected to that of another man, Stephen Kocher, who had disappeared in Nevada the same week as Susan. The blog posts claimed that both Susan and Kocher had run off together to Brazil. It was, for lack of a better word, bizarre. Steve Powell, Josh's father, would go as far as presenting this theory to the FBI in a sit-down interview he had with investigators. They, of course, took no stock in Steve's theory. Josh was still their prime suspect. Months had now passed since Susan Powell had disappeared. Charlie, Josh's son, began making disturbing comments at school, saying that his mother was dead, that he hated Mormons, and that he wanted to kill another classmate. Josh and his family began to use the SusanPowell.org website to make even more disparaging comments against Susan and her family. They claimed Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, had abused her. They began to publish excerpts of Susan's childhood journals as their evidence. Of course, these claims of abuse were unfounded. Chuck Cox, Susan's father, filed a lawsuit against Josh. The cause of action was invasion of privacy. Police then filed a search warrant on Steve Powell's home. The raid was conducted on August 25, 2011. They retrieved Susan's journals along with multiple encrypted computers and hard drives, and Stephen Powell's personal VHS and Hi-8 tape collection. Investigators then began the daunting process of reviewing each of Steve's tapes. They discovered all of the hundreds of hours of footage of Susan that Stephen had taken over the years. They also discovered tapes of Steve masturbating to pictures of Susan. Then they discovered something unexpected. Steve had filmed two prepubescent girls through their bathroom window. In the footage, the girls were naked or partially clothed. After an investigation, detectives discovered that they had lived next door to Stephen Powell. They found more than 1,600 images of those young neighbors. And so, Steve Powell was arrested on charges of voyeurism and possession of explicit images of minors. the state of Washington decided that they were going to take Charlie and Braden into protective custody, as they had been living in Steve Powell's home. As police came to retrieve Charlie and Braden, Josh seemed uninterested. In fact, he seemed relieved. He suspected that the police were there to arrest him. The next day, Friday, September 23rd, 2011, Josh had 2 court hearings in the morning over his feud with the Coxes in the matter of publishing Susan's journals. Judge Vicky Hoden presided over the diary case and ruled with the Cox family, saying that Susan's journals cannot be released. There's no legitimate public interest and they are not public record. At the same time, Steve made his initial court appearance. He pleaded not guilty to all 15 counts. His efforts would not work. He would be sentenced to prison for his crimes. Chuck Cox told reporters that in spite of Steve's arrest, they were no closer to finding out what had happened to Susan. He told reporters that he would do everything in his power to get custody of Charlie and Braden. Rocky Stevenson, a social worker, attempted to interview both Charlie and Braden, but neither were willing to talk about their family life. It had been clear that the children had been coached. That afternoon, Children's Administration allowed Josh to have a supervised visit with his sons. The next day, the state of Washington placed the boys with Chuck and Judy Cox. Josh, the Coxes, and state social workers all met before a judge on the morning of Tuesday, September 28th. Josh said he wanted the boys back. Failing that, he wanted them in a foster home anywhere but with his in-laws. The judge disagreed on both counts. Josh said he didn't want his sons attending any religious services, and so the court allowed Josh a 3-hour supervised visitation window on Sundays while the Coxes were at church. Social worker James Manley was hired by the state to put Josh through what is known as a psychological evaluation for parenting capacity. James Manley was sent a pile of paperwork. It included news clippings about the Susan Powell disappearance. Towards the end of October, he sat down with Josh for a formal interview. James Manley determined that Josh was a narcissist. He later came to believe that Josh's narcissism extended to the boys. He did not view him as their children, but rather extensions of himself. The judge told Josh he could not have the children at the house for overnight visits unless he moved out of Steve Powell's home. And so Josh rented a 3-bedroom house on a cul-de-sac not too far from Charlie's school. Detectives in West Valley continued to search through the computers and hard drives that they had found during their initial searches of Josh Powell's home. During this search, investigators found some disturbing images. They were drawings of pornography, one of them showing computer-generated images of popular cartoon characters engaging in acts of incest. Officers presented these images to psychologist James Manley. Manley drafted a follow-up to his original report. He expressed deep concern over what he had seen. The pictures, he said, suggested that Josh showed, quote, global approval of sex acts between adults and children. The judge then ordered Josh to undergo a psychosexual evaluation. Josh asked another psychologist what he could expect in this evaluation. Josh learned he would be hooked up to a lie detector test and asked questions ranging from when he had his first kiss to how many sexual partners he had had to what kind of pornographic material he looked at. They could also ask him questions about Susan and her disappearance. Josh knew that he would not be able to get past a lie detector test. On the Saturday following that court hearing, Josh drove to his bank. He withdrew some cash and then transferred the remaining balance to an account belonging to his little sister, Alina. He then drove to his storage unit and spent more than an hour going through his things. He loaded them into his minivan and dumped it off at a recycling center. He then went to his home and took all of Charlie and Braden's toys and books out of the house. He donated them to the local Goodwill. When he returned home, he parked his van in the garage next to a pair of 5-gallon gas cans that he had bought earlier. They were both full of gasoline. February 5th, 2012, Super Bowl Sunday. Social worker Elizabeth Griffin Hall was bringing in Charlie and Braden Powell over for their usual Sunday visit with their dad. Josh opened the door as they walked up. "I have a surprise for you," Josh said. The giddy boys took off, hurrying through the front door past their father. Elizabeth ran after them. Josh looked straight into her eyes and then slammed the door and locked it. Elizabeth pounded on the door. Josh did not answer. She rang the doorbell. Again, no answer. She started shouting, ordering Josh to open the door. She rang the bell over and over and over again. She got no response. She began to beg, "Please let me in." Then she heard something terrible. A child inside, crying. She smelled the unmistakable odor of gasoline. Her pulse quickened, her breathing accelerated. She ran back to her car and dialed 911. It was 12:08 p.m. It was a frustrating 911 call. The dispatcher seemed confused. He said that there were real emergencies police were out on and that they would arrive at the house when they had time. The call then ended. Then it happened. The house ignited. Fire, fueled by gasoline, moved so fast that it seemed like an explosion. Heat burst the windows and thick black smoke billowed out. The first sheriff deputies arrived at the house at 12:30 p.m., 22 minutes after Elizabeth had placed her 911 call. It was too late. 3 bodies were found in the house, all together in the back bedroom. They were confirmed to be Josh, Charlie, and Braden Powell. A blackened metal hatchet sat next to Josh's body. Later, it was determined that Josh had used it to bludgeon both the boys on the back of their neck, knocking them unconscious. Coroners determined that fire and smoke inhalation were the actual causes of death. If Josh had written any sort of confession letter or note, it burned away with the rest of the house. Family members, including Chuck, Judy, and Jennifer, grieved publicly. All of the family's worst fears were realized. Shockingly, this story does not end there. More death would occur in the Powell family. Investigators had turned their attention to Michael Powell, Josh's brother. Over the years, they had begun to suspect that he was involved in Susan's disappearance. Back in 2009, just days after her disappearance, Michael's car had broken down as he was driving to Washington from Josh's house. Instead of getting it fixed, he decided to leave it at a local junkyard. Investigators had now discovered this information and focused all their eyes on Michael. They suspected that Michael was in charge of getting rid of a piece of secondary evidence. Michael could not handle the scrutiny. On February 11, 2013, Michael Powell jumped from the roof of a parking garage. He died instantly. He did not leave a note. Whatever knowledge Michael may have had about Josh's crimes died with him. On May 21, 2013, West Valley City Police announced that they had closed the active investigation into Susan's disappearance. Officially, she is presumed murdered. The whereabouts of her remains have never been found. Josh's sister Jennifer would go on to write a memoir about the Powell family's history. Titled A Light in Dark Places, it was published on June 2013. She said she was inspired to write it to, quote, help other people recognize abuse either in their own relationships or relationships around them. In March of 2015, Chuck Cox won a long court battle against Tarika and Alina Powell over the control of Susan's estate. The Cox family also sued Washington's Department of Social and Health Services, DSHS, and its social workers, claiming that the agency prioritized Josh's parental rights over the safety of the boys. In 2015, a federal court ruled that the social workers had immunity and that DSHS was not negligent. In 2019, a court overturned that decision. At a trial, a jury ruled that DSHS was negligent and avoided $98 million to the estate of Susan's 2 sons. Susan's family also pressured state lawmakers in Washington and Utah to pass bills that would restrict or block visitation rights for parents being investigated for murder. Steve Powell was released from prison on July 11, 2017, after serving a total of 7 years. He died of natural causes in Tacoma, Washington on July 23, 2018. Detectives do not believe he was involved in the disappearance of Susan Powell. Each year, Chuck Cox holds a candlelight vigil to honor his daughter Susan. Dozens of people gather each year around an angel statue in Woodbine Cemetery that's dedicated to Susan's honor. Chuck Cox remains hopeful that one day Susan will be found. Thank you for watching today's video and for taking this ride on the crime wave with me. Until next time, be safe.